Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive with us.
It's great to be back.
Today we're going to be tackling something that is pretty fundamental to English.
Okay.
We're going to be looking at the verb to be, but more specifically, we're going to be focusing on the past simple.
Sounds good. I think that's a great place to start for anyone learning English.
Yeah. And I mean, it's a pretty simple verb when you think about it in the present tense, right? Like I am, you are, he is, she is, it is, we are, they are. Like pretty straightforward.
Yeah, it's one of those verbs that you use all the time without even thinking about it.
Yeah. But it's super important. Like we use it to describe, who we are, where we are, how we feel.
Exactly. Like, I am at home, I am happy,
Yeah.
Basic building blocks of sentences.
Totally. But then things get a little bit more interesting when we want to talk about, the past.
Right. How do we talk about things that have already happened?
Exactly. So that's where the past simple of to be comes in. And luckily for us, it only has two forms.
Only two? That's pretty manageable.
Right. So we have was and we have were.
Okay.
And they're pretty easy to remember which one goes where because, you use was for singular subjects like I, he, she, it.
So you'd say, like, I was tired yesterday, or she was at the store.
Exactly. And then when you have plural subjects, so like you, we, they, that's when where comes into play.
So we could say we were at the beach last weekend, or they were excited about the party.
Perfect examples. And it's really just as easy as swapping out that present tense is or are for was or were.
So like a little time machine for our sentences.
Totally.
Yeah.
Now, let's take a look at how we can make negative sentences in the past simple.
Okay, so we know how to say things happened. How do we say they didn't?
Yeah. And it's really simple. You just add not after was or were.
Oh, so I could say something like, I was not at work yesterday.
Perfect. Or you could say they were not happy with the results.
Exactly. And of course, we can use contractions to make it sound more natural. Wasn't and weren't.
Yeah. So you could say, I wasn't feeling well yesterday, or they weren't able to come to the party.
See, this is pretty straightforward.
It is.
Oh.
And, once you start using these negative forms in your sentences, you'll really start to sound more fluent and more comfortable with the past tense.
It's all about practice.
Exactly. Now, are you ready for a little challenge?
Bring it on.
Okay, so I'm going to give you a sentence in the present tense, and I want you to transform it into a negative past tense sentence using either wasn't or weren't.
All right, let's do it.
Okay. He is at work today.
He wasn't at work yesterday?
Perfect.
Okay.
Okay, how about they are happy with the results?
They weren't happy with the results.
Awesome. You're getting it. Now let's move on to questions.
Questions. Okay, how do we ask those in the past tense?
Well, remember how in the present tense we use is or are at the beginning of the sentence for questions?
Right, like, is he at work?
Yeah. It's the same idea with was and were. We just move them to the front of the sentence.
Oh, so if I wanted to ask if you were tired this morning, I would say, were you tired this morning?
Exactly. Or was she at school yesterday?
This is making more sense now. So we can ask about anything in the past using this structure.
Exactly. You can ask about the weather, about people, about events, anything.
Was the movie good? Were they at the concert? See, I'm getting the hang of this.
You are. Now, why don't you try turning a few statements into questions for me?
All right, sounds like fun.
Okay, here's the first one. You were tired this morning?
Were you tired this morning?
See, easy. Okay, how about this one? She was happy with her gift.
Was she happy with her gift?
Perfect. You're a natural at this. Now that you've got questions down pat, let's dive a little deeper into how we can use was and were to talk about specific points in time. Like, how do we describe our childhood or talk about historical events?
Oh, that sounds interesting. I'm ready to travel back in time. It's really amazing how much we can do with just was and were. Like, we can talk about simple things that happen, but we can also describe things, talk about feelings, really get creative with it.
Yeah. It's like we've unlocked this whole new level of expression in the past tense. So like, remember earlier we were talking about describing a vacation.
Yeah, you said the beach was beautiful.
Exactly. But we can make that even more interesting, right? Like instead of just beautiful, we could say the beach was peaceful and serene, or the sand was soft and white.
Ah, I see. So we're not just saying what happened, but we're really painting a picture with our words.
Yeah. And it's the same with actions too. Like instead of just I was reading, we could say I was engrossed in a captivating novel.
I like that. It sounds so much more engaging.
Right. And we can do the same thing with feelings, too.
Ooh, feelings. Okay, give me an example.
Okay, so instead of just saying I was happy, you can say I was overjoyed or I was filled with a sense of accomplishment.
I see. So we're using was and were to express the intensity of our emotions, not just, that we felt something, but how strongly we felt it.
Exactly. And that's really important when we're trying to tell a story or connect with someone on a deeper level.
Because it's those details, those nuances that really make a difference.
Totally. Now
Yeah.
remember how earlier we were talking about Abraham Lincoln and we said, he was the 16th president.
Right.
But we can use was to say more about him than just his job title.
Hmm.
Like we could say Lincoln was known for his honesty and determination.
Ah, so we're using was to describe his character, his personality. We're adding more depth to who he was.
Yeah. And we can do this with anyone, not just historical figures. Like you could say my grandmother was a kind and loving woman or my best friend was always the life of the party.
I like that. It's like we're adding layers to our descriptions, making them richer and more meaningful.
Exactly. Now, remember earlier when we touched on hypothetical situations?
Yeah, those were fun, like what if scenarios.
Yeah. So let's play around with those a bit more. Like what if you hadn't taken this deep dive with me today?
Ooh, let me think. Well, I could say if I hadn't listened to this episode, I wouldn't have learned so much about was and were.
Perfect. You see how we're using those hypothetical structures like hadn't and wouldn't have? But within those structures, we're still using was and were to describe the imagined situation.
So it's like we're creating these alternate timelines, these what if worlds, using was and were as our building blocks.
Yeah. And it's amazing how these simple verbs can take us to all these different places and possibilities. Now, I'm curious. We've talked about describing people, places, feelings, even actions. But can we use was and were to talk about ideas or concepts too?
That's a good question. I mean, can we?
Yeah, totally. Think about how we talk about history. We might say the Renaissance was a period of great artistic and cultural flourishing.
I see. So we're using was to define the Renaissance to explain what it represented.
Exactly. And we could do the same with all sorts of abstract ideas. Like
Yeah.
we could say democracy was a radical concept in ancient Greece, or freedom was a central theme in many American novels.
So was and were help us to grasp the essence of these big ideas and see how they fit into the bigger picture.
Yeah. It's like we're going beyond just describing what we see and feel and we're starting to explore the deeper meaning of things.
This is getting pretty philosophical, but I like it. It's like we're uncovering all these hidden layers of was and were.
Totally. And as you continue to learn English, I encourage you to play around with these verbs, experiment with different sentence structures, explore different ways of expressing yourself, and see what you discover.
It's like we've been given these amazing tools, and now it's up to us to use them to build something beautiful.
I love that analogy. And remember, practice makes perfect. The more you use was and were, the more comfortable and confident you'll become.
And the more fun you'll have. So before we move on, how about we each share a favorite memory from our past using was and were to really bring it to life?
Ooh, I like that idea. Okay, I'll go first. I remember when I was about 10 years old, my family took a trip to the mountains. The air was crisp and cool, the trees were ablaze with autumn colors, and the sound of a nearby stream was like a soothing melody. We spent the day hiking through the forest, and in the evening we roasted marshmallows over a crackling campfire. It was a perfect day, filled with laughter, adventure, and a sense of wonder that I'll never forget.
Wow, that sounds like an amazing memory. You really painted a beautiful picture with your words. Okay, my turn. I remember when I was in college and I was taking this literature course that just blew my mind. The professor was brilliant, the discussions were so interesting, and the books we read, they just opened up whole new worlds for me. It was a time of incredible intellectual growth, and I really treasure that experience.
That sounds like such a pivotal time in your life. And it's incredible how was and were can transport us back to those moments, those feelings, so vividly. But our journey with these verbs isn't over yet.
Welcome back to our deep dive, everyone. We've covered so much ground already with was and were, going from the basic how-tos to painting vivid pictures with our words and even exploring those what-if scenarios. But I think there's one more layer to these verbs that's really fascinating.
Sometimes when we learn a language, we get so caught up in the nuts and bolts of it all, the grammar rules, the sentence structures.
Yeah.
But language is so much more than that, right?
Oh,
It's like it's a window into who we are, where we come from, how we see the world.
Yeah. And I bet was and were Being such like core parts of English, they probably have a lot to tell us about the history of the language itself.
You know, you're absolutely right. The way we use was and were today, it's actually the result of like centuries of evolution. If you go way back to Old English, you know, like
Yeah.
the ancestor of modern English,
Mm.
they had totally different forms of to be. And over time, those forms kind of like morphed and simplified until, you know, we ended up with was and were.
Wow. So it's like these little verbs are carrying these like echoes of the past, you know?
I like that, echoes of the past. And it reminds us that language is always changing, always adapting.
Yeah. Speaking of adapting, I was thinking about how was and were pop up in like different art forms, you know? Like in
Oh.
literature, authors use them all the time to set the scene, describe characters.
Oh, totally. Like, think about a classic novel like Pride and Prejudice.
Mhm.
Jane Austen uses was and were to, like, transport us right back to 19th century England. You know, you can practically hear the rustle of dresses and see the candlelight in those grand ballrooms.
Mhm. It's like she's weaving this tapestry of the past, and those little verbs are some of the key threads.
Exactly. And it's not just books, right? Think about song lyrics. How many times have you heard was and were used to, like, express heartbrim or joy?
Oh yeah, countless times. They're woven into the fabric of music. And what about movies?
Oh, for sure. I mean, especially in historical dramas or even sci-fi movies that create these alternate pasts, right?
Right.
Was and were
Yeah.
help to ground those stories, make them feel real.
It's incredible. Like those two little words have become these like universal tools for storytelling. They can transport us across time, across genres, you know?
And the cool thing is, as you become more and more comfortable with was and were, you'll start to notice them everywhere.
Yeah.
Like in conversations, in the news, you know, they'll just pop out at you.
It's like they become more visible, like these hidden treasures.
Exactly. And by paying attention to how other people use them, you'll pick up on all these subtle nuances, these regional differences.
And our understanding of those verbs will keep growing and evolving, just like the language itself.
Right. And, you know, as much as we've enjoyed this deep dive into was and were, it's really just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to English.
There's so much more to discover. You know?
Yeah.
All these other verbs, tenses, grammatical structures. It's a never-ending journey.
It really is. But that's what makes it so exciting.
Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive today. I hope you all feel a little more confident, a little more fluent with was and were.
Yes. And don't forget to have fun with it. Keep exploring, keep experimenting, and most importantly, keep learning.
We'll see you on our next deep dive.